By October 1944, the Western Pacific balance had shifted. After the Marianas Campaign placed B-29 bases within range of Japan and U.S. carrier groups demonstrated sustained reach, American planners reopened the Philippines with landings scheduled for Leyte. Control of the archipelago's sea lanes would cut Japan's oil route from Borneo and the Netherlands East Indies. U.S. command divided responsibilities. Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey to strike broadly with fast carriers, and 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid to cover the amphibious force and the immediate approaches to Leyte. Submarine force patrol lines were extended across probable Japanese transit corridors, including the Palawan Passage, a confined channel east of Borneo that funneled traffic along predictable tracks. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet agreed on Shogo 1, a concentrated counterstroke intended to disrupt the Leyte landings. Its concept hinged on multiple forces. Admiral Kurita Takeo's center force from Linga and Brunei, with battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna. Heavy cruisers including Atago, Takao, Maya, Chokai, Tone, and others. Light cruisers and destroyers. A northern decoy force under Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo would draw U.S. fast carriers north, while southern forces attempted to push through Surigao Strait. The center force, largest in gunpowder, had to pass through the Palawan Passage into the Sibuyan Sea and then toward Leyte Gulf. Japanese staff weighed risks, confined waters, limited air cover, and acute fuel constraints after months of convoy losses reduced training tempo and cruising speeds. The expectation was that surprise, night navigation, and concentrated daylight thrusts could offset disadvantages. On the American side, intelligence from aerial reconnaissance, radio traffic analysis, and standard patrol experience suggested that any major Japanese sortie from Brunei or Linga would likely choose Palawan Passage to save distance and fuel. U.S. submarines were therefore positioned in pairs to share contact reporting and attack opportunities. Among them were USS Darter, SS-227, and USS Dace, SS-247, operating as a coordinated unit with instructions to shadow and strike high-value targets. Their commanders understood the geometry of the channel. Reefs and shoals compressed the shipping lane, reducing evasive options once torpedoes were in the water. Communications plans emphasized rapid contact reports to vector additional submarines and carrier aircraft if needed. Local conditions shaped civilian experience as well. The Palawan coast and adjacent islands hosted fishing communities and inter-island traders accustomed to pre-war routes now intersected by wartime patrols. Navigation lights were extinguished or unreliable, and maritime movement occurred under curfew or camouflage. The region's geography, long reefs, narrow passes, and limited deep draft alternatives made merchant and naval traffic visible at distance but also constrained by predictable waypoints. For both navies, the passage offered speed and risk in equal measure, a direct line toward decisive battle for the Japanese, and a natural ambush corridor for American submarines. Public sentiment and expectations reflected the strategic moment. In the United States, communiques after the Marianas and carrier raids built confidence that the Philippines could be retaken on a defined timetable, with submarines credited for steadily reducing Japanese tanker capacity. In Japan, official statements emphasized the remaining striking power of battleships and heavy cruisers, and framed Shogo 1 as an opportunity to reverse recent losses by destroying U.S. transports off Leyte. Within staffs on both sides, estimates converged on a critical fact. Any interruption of Japanese heavy units en route, particularly in choke points like Palawan Passage, could change the balance at Leyte before surface guns ever engaged. Before dawn on the 23rd of October, 1944, Kurita's center force cleared the South China Sea approach and entered the Palawan Passage in multiple columns. The lead heavy cruisers Atago, Takao, and Maya formed part of the main body with battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna distributed to balance firepower and armor across the formation. Light cruisers and destroyers screened ahead and abeam. Fuel economy dictated a cruising speed near 16 to 18 knots. Radio silence and minimal night signals aimed to reduce detection risk. Lookouts were reinforced, but air cover was distant and intermittent. The navigation plan relied on known waypoints, with destroyers sounding for shoals where charts indicated hazards. U.S. submarines assigned to the patrol line west of Palawan executed a coordinated watch. USS Darter and USS Dace operated as a pair with radar search at night and periscope tracking at first light. Their orders prioritized contact reporting and attacks against capital ships or heavy cruisers. Torpedo loadouts were balanced between steam and electric types to manage wakes and range. Standard doctrine called for a first salvo to disable, a second to finish, and immediate evasion below the thermal layer. Initial contact occurred in the early hours when surface search radar painted multiple large targets on a steady easterly course. Darter transmitted a contact report identifying a force of battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers proceeding through the passage toward the Sibuyan Sea. The message reached U.S. commands responsible for Leyte approaches, confirming expectations that any major sortie would funnel through this channel. Dace shifted to a flanking position to cover a likely turn point, while Darter prepared an attack track based on bearing drift and estimated speed. Japanese command procedures during the transit reflected Shogo, 1 priorities. Kurita remained on Otago, with staff focused on timing the passage to reach Leyte waters as carrier strikes elsewhere drew U.S. air strength north. Screening destroyers cycled positions to conserve fuel and reduce fatigue, but the screen density around the main body was thinner than pre-war standards due to shortages and maintenance attrition. Anti-submarine zigzags were conducted, though constrained by the need to maintain column order in reef-lined waters. Hydrophone and sonar teams monitored intermittently. The confined bathymetry complicated interpretations of returns. As the first light strengthened, visibility improved for both sides. The U.S. pair refined ranges and angles, plotting a firing solution that would cross the leading column at a favorable aspect. The geography of Palawan Passage, reefs channeling deep water into a narrow lane, simplified prediction of Japanese track, but also limited the submarine's evasion options after firing. The plan called for Darter to strike first at the flagship elements, with Dace holding fire for trailing heavy cruisers and to counter pursuers. Civilians along Palawan's coast registered the unusual nocturnal movement only in fragments, distant engine noise rolling across the water, and occasional silhouettes against the eastern sky. Local traffic stayed out of the deep draft route, restricted by wartime bans and the risks of misidentification. No harbor lights or radio beacons were active. For fishing families and inter-island traders, the morning offered little more than evidence that large forces were passing through waters that earlier in the war had carried ordinary commerce. By mid-morning, the opening conditions were set. A large Japanese formation had chosen the shortest lane toward Leyte, accepting choke point exposure to preserve time and fuel. A U.S. submarine pair held a firing position refined by radar plots and periscope bearings. Commanders on both sides faced the same constraint. In a confined sea corridor, a first strike could create ship handling congestion that magnified losses or opened escape routes, depending on how quickly formations reacted and how well damage control contained the initial hits. Strategically, both commands framed Palawan Passage as a timing problem shaped by fuel, geography, and air threat. For Japan, Shogo 1 required Admiral Kurita's center force, battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna, heavy cruisers of cruiser divisions 4, 5, and 7, light cruisers and destroyers of several squadrons, to pass the choke point swiftly, conserve fuel for high-speed runs in the Sibuyan Sea, then reach San Bernardino Strait by night. The operational goal was to enter Leyte Gulf on 25 October and strike troop transports and logistics shipping of 7th Fleet. The decoy carrier group under Ozawa was tasked to draw 3rd Fleet north. Southern forces would converge via Surigao Strait. The plan assumed that if center force arrived intact with heavy ammunition loads, armor-piercing shells for battleship and cruiser main batteries, it could impose decisive damage on the amphibious anchorages even without strong air cover. Resource constraints dictated parameters. Fuel lifted at Brunei limited sustained high-speed steaming. Destroyer screens rotated stations to economize consumption. Air cover from Luzon bases could not remain continuously overhead, and night transit was used to reduce exposure. Anti-submarine doctrine emphasized zigzagging and sonar watch, but the density of the screen fell below pre-war tables because of losses and maintenance delays. Hydrophones and available sonar sets were serviceable, yet hampered by shallow, reef-bounded acoustics. Charts for the passage were adequate for the main lane, but left little margin for evasive turns without risking shoals. Japanese staff work accepted these risks to keep the arrival window aligned with Ozawa's feint and the southern thrust. U.S. planning aimed to attrit the Japanese before surface contact near Leyte. Submarine patrol lines were stationed along likely transit corridors, Palawan Passage among them, to inflict early losses, reveal order of battle, and slow the enemy timetable. Coordinated attack doctrine paired boats so one could shoot, while the other shadowed and finished cripples. Standard equipment included SJ surface search radar, TDC torpedo data computer for continuous solutions, and mixed torpedo loads, electric Mark 8s for wakeless shots and steam, Mark 14/23s for range and reliability improvements after earlier war modifications. Orders poised prioritized capital ships and heavy cruisers, with immediate contact reports to Q carrier aviation if weather and distance allowed. At the fleet level, the Americans divided roles. Third Fleet fast carriers ranged broadly to engage enemy air and surface units. Seventh Fleet covered the Leyte lodgment with escort carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Intercepts of Japanese communications and pattern analysis from reconnaissance suggested that any major force departing Lingga or Brunei would likely choose Palawan Passage for distance and fuel efficiency. However, planners did not assume perfect foreknowledge. Shadowing was essential to confirm composition, speed, and heading, and to determine whether the enemy would commit through San Bernardino or divert south. Logistics and maintenance influenced readiness on both sides. Japanese heavy units carried full main battery allowances and limited high-capacity shells for shore bombardment. Destroyers carried depth charges but lacked the volume needed to saturate a wide contact area for long periods. Boiler and machinery status reduced some ships' endurance at flank speed, tightening formation geometry. American submarines, rotating from Fremantle and forward areas, arrived with fresh batteries and recent radar sets. Torpedo reliability had improved compared to 1942 to 1943, but doctrine still allowed for follow-up shots in case of duds or premature detonations. Each boat tracked fuel state carefully to preserve endurance for pursuit after an initial strike. Information control and public messaging reflected strategic aims. In Japan, communiques highlighted the striking power of battleships and framed the operation as a counterblow to disrupt U.S. landings. In the United States, public releases emphasized submarine and carrier effectiveness in reducing Japanese shipping and protecting the Leyte assault. Neither narrative detailed the risks inherent in a narrow, reef-lined corridor where a single successful attack could create traffic congestion, command disruption, and loss of timing critical to the larger plan. Miscalculations were embedded in assumptions. Japanese planners discounted the likelihood that paired U.S. submarines would achieve undetected radar tracking across much of the night transit, and overestimated the protective value of standard screen spacing in confined waters. American staffs, while expecting contact, still had to reconcile uncertainties about the exact composition and speed of the approaching force, and the possibility that the enemy might stagger groups to complicate attack geometry. Both sides understood that Palawan Passage compressed choices. Once committed to the lane, deviations for evasion risked reefs. Maintaining column order preserved navigation, but increased vulnerability to torpedo spreads aligned across the track. At first light on the 23rd of October, 1944, contact turned into engagement. USS Darter closed the leading column on a crossing track and fired a spread at the largest radar and periscope silhouette, later identified as the heavy cruiser Atago, flagship of Admiral Kurita. Multiple hits followed in quick sequence. Flooding and fires developed. Within minutes, the flagship lost power and took a heavy list. Kurita transferred command to a destroyer and was later brought aboard the battleship Yamato. Otago sank shortly after, with 360 killed and over 1,100 rescued. Darter's commander used bearing drift to set a second solution on a following cruiser, Takao. 2 hits disabled propulsion and caused structural damage that reduced speed and maneuverability. The ship began counter-flooding and steering by engines to remain underway. Screening destroyers laid smoke and initiated depth charge attacks along the assumed submarine track, while Takao turned out of column for emergency measures and later withdrew under escort. Casualties on Takao numbered 68 killed, with hundreds injured but stabilized by onboard medical teams. USS Dace, positioned to cover the parallel lane, targeted the heavy cruiser Maya. A salvo from close range produced multiple detonations. Maya capsized and sank rapidly. Records indicate 336 killed, with approximately 770 survivors collected by nearby destroyers. The loss of 2 heavy cruisers within minutes, combined with the crippling of a third, disrupted column order and forced evasive turns that risked reefs on the channel edge. Destroyers shifted from screen to rescue and anti-submarine roles, reducing the density of protection around battleships and remaining cruisers. For the American pair, the immediate results aligned with doctrine. Neither submarine suffered damage in the launch phase, and both cleared the area using pre-planned evasion routes across the thermal layer while transmitting contact and battle damage reports. Torpedo employment reflected mixed loads: wakeless electric weapons for close, daytime solutions, and steam torpedoes for longer shots when geometry allowed. Communications emphasized confirmation of hits, composition updates, and course speed estimates so other units could anticipate next moves. Operationally, the strikes had effects beyond the loss figures. With the flagship gone and a damaged cruiser requiring escort, the center force's command rhythm shifted. Staff work and signal procedures transferred to Yamato under time pressure. The formation executed emergency maneuvers to regain order in a confined space where shoal margins limited lateral spread. This produced short-term course reversals and speed changes that complicated navigation and increased the risk of further submarine approaches. Ammunition states on the surviving cruisers remained high, but their availability for the planned thrust toward Leyte was altered by rescue and escort assignments. On the human level, the contrast in experience was sharp. Japanese cruiser crews worked through damage control protocols, shoring bulkheads, rigging pumps, jettisoning topside weight, while destroyer crews balanced rescue with anti-submarine prosecution, counting depth charges and fuel against the possibility of additional contacts. Submarine crews operated in cramped compartments at battle stations, cycling periscope observations, TDC updates, and trim adjustments as depth charges detonated at set intervals. Civilians along the Palawan coast observed columns of smoke on the horizon and increased destroyer movement, but remained distant from the deep draft lane and rescue zones due to wartime restrictions. By late morning, the initial clash had reshaped the order of battle. Japanese heavy cruisers, reduced by 2, sunk, Otago, Maya, and 1 heavily damaged, Takao, versus no U.S. submarine losses in the engagement. The immediate tactical picture featured dispersed units, altered command arrangements, and a center force that faced a timing dilemma. Continue through the passage under threat of further submarine attacks, or delay and regroup, at the risk of missing coordination windows with the northern decoy and southern thrust. The hours after the torpedo strikes forced both commands into rapid adjustments. For the center force, 2 heavy cruisers lost, and 1 disabled, meant redistributing screens, altering station keeping, and revalidating timing for the run towards San Bernardino. The staff now aboard Yamato reissued course and speed instructions to clear the immediate danger area, while destroyers conducted rescue and anti-submarine actions. Fuel and ammunition tracking became urgent. Each diversion for recovery or prosecution consumed reserves planned for the Sibuyan Sea transit. With cruiser numbers reduced, long-range scouting and gunnery coordination tasks that those ships typically handled had to be reassigned to surviving units. Anti-submarine efforts escalated along the presumed tracks of USS Darter and USS Dace. Japanese destroyers laid patterns of depth charges in series, using sonar contacts intermittently disrupted by the reef-lined acoustics. Each pass required speed changes and tight turns that increased fuel burn and widened the formation footprint. Smoke screens were renewed to obscure silhouettes against the morning light, but the geometry of the channel still compressed movement into predictable lanes. Rescue of survivors from Otago and Maya competed with prosecution of submarine contacts, drawing screening ships away from their anti-torpedo sectors and reducing the density around the battleships. On the U.S. side, the coordinated submarine pair transitioned from strike to shadow. Darter and Dace exchanged updated contact data and repositioned to watch for course corrections or emergency turns that might expose further targets. Contact reports forwarded the revised order of battle, battleships intact, cruisers reduced, destroyer dispositions altered, and estimated speeds consistent with a force intent on clearing the passage quickly. The boats faced limits of their own, remaining torpedo inventories after multiple salvos, battery charge management following high-power maneuvers, and the risk of counter-detection if they lingered in water shallow enough to constrain evasion depths. The damage to Takao created a separate operational thread. Escorted by destroyers, the cruiser withdrew at reduced speed, steering challenges compounded by flooding and structural strain. For Japanese command, this meant accepting the loss of another heavy unit's immediate availability and assigning scarce escorts to shepherd it away from the main body. The decision reduced the striking mass intended for Leyte, but protected trained crews and a hull still recoverable for future service if repairs proved feasible at rear area facilities. Crisis management extended to navigation. The center force's temporary course and speed changes to avoid suspected submarine positions increased the chance of traffic compression near shoals. Signal discipline emphasized short, necessary transmissions to preserve radio silence while maintaining column order. Lookout fatigue, heightened by night transit and the shock of the morning attacks, required rotation schedules that further taxed manpower on destroyers already tasked with screening, rescue, and sonar watch. As day turned to evening, the Americans aimed to maintain contact without overcommitting. Submarine doctrine favored persistence on the enemy's wake, rather than repeated high-risk close engagements in shoal-constrained waters. Darter and Dace planned to track through the night into the approaches of the Sibuyan Sea, where deeper water would restore evasion margins and allow attack geometries less restricted by reefs. Communications repeated the center force's composition update and warned that reduced cruiser numbers could shift the balance of the next day's battle, air-sea engagements by altering anti-aircraft arcs and command redundancy within the formation. Unintended consequences emerged. Late on October 23rd to 24th, while maneuvering to maintain position near the enemy track, Darter grounded hard on Bombay Shoal. The submarine's crew attempted to back clear, but remained fast. Standard destruction procedures followed. Demolition of classified equipment, spiking of torpedoes, and transfer of personnel to Dace under darkness. Subsequent efforts to scuttle the stranded hull by torpedo and gunfire reduced but did not immediately eliminate the wreck. The loss removed one U.S. boat from further pursuit, just as contact reports indicated the Japanese would enter the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th. Dace continued alone, with orders to shadow and exploit any new opportunities. For civilians along Palawan and adjacent islands, escalation manifested as extended columns of smoke on the horizon, additional destroyer wake patterns, and increased nighttime noise. Local maritime movement remained restricted by wartime regulations. Small craft stayed clear of the deep draft lane. Onshore, there were no large-scale evacuations or direct bombardments connected to the passage events, but uncertainty rose as rumors spread about ship losses and the direction of travel for both fleets. By the end of the 23rd, the crisis had reshaped options without resolving the larger campaign. Comparative figures stood at 2 Japanese heavy cruisers sunk, 1 heavy cruiser disabled and withdrawing, battleships intact, U.S. submarines unscathed in the attack phase but reduced by 1 hull due to grounding. The center force still aimed for San Bernardino Strait, but its timeline and internal coordination had been altered by rescue obligations, fuel consumption, and the transfer of flagship functions. The American undersea force had achieved attrition and disclosure of the enemy's route, yet faced the immediate challenge of continuing the shadow with fewer assets into waters where air power, not submarines, would likely dominate the next decisions. On 24 October 1944, the consequences of the Palawan transit reached their peak in the Sibuyan Sea. Kurita's center force, now without Atago and Maya and minus Takao, advanced with 6 battleships and a reduced cruiser screen. U.S. contact reports from the passage guided Task Force 38 to concentrate air power from multiple carrier groups, F-6Fs, SB, 2Cs, and TBMS, launched in successive waves to attack the formation before it could reach San Bernardino Strait. Weather offered intermittent cloud cover, but not enough to mask the large wakes of battleships at battle speed. Japanese dispositions reflected earlier losses. Battleships Yamato and Musashi held central positions. Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna formed accompanying echelons. Heavy cruisers including Chokai, Tone, and others maintained anti-air roles. Destroyers tightened screens to fill gaps left by the Palawan sinkings. Anti-aircraft batteries were fully manned, and damage control parties were pre-positioned with pumping and shoring equipment. Land-based air cover was limited and could not maintain continuous fighter presence over the fleet. Ammunition states for main batteries remained high, but the engagement now depended on layered AA and maneuver. The first U.S. strikes tested the screen. Fighters suppressed top-deck gunnery, while torpedo bombers pressed low approaches to converge from both quarters, seeking to force conflicting turns. Dive bombers attacked from altitude to split attention. Musashi, a prominent target due to radar cross-section and column position, absorbed early hits and near misses that reduced speed and complicated station keeping. As additional waves arrived, damage accumulated, progressive flooding, degraded steering responses, and power interruptions, forcing destroyers to lay smoke and close for assistance. Myoko suffered torpedo damage and turned back under escort, reducing heavy cruiser numbers further. American attack coordination aimed to maintain pressure rather than mass all weapons in a single moment. Staggered arrivals stretched Japanese A ammunition expenditure, and crew endurance. Carrier groups rotated deck cycles to keep TBMS and SB-2CS inbound at intervals, with F-6FS providing escort and strafing of exposed mounts. Pilots reported ship movements consistent with commanders attempting to keep bows toward torpedoes while avoiding dive bomb patterns, a trade-off that strained formation geometry and widened separations. By mid-afternoon, Musashi's condition deteriorated beyond recoverable control. Counter-flooding and pumping temporarily stabilized list, but cumulative torpedo and bomb damage reduced buoyancy and power. Orders shifted to save personnel and clear the path for the remaining capital ships. The redistribution of escorts for rescue and screening thinned protection around Yamato and other battleships. Yet those units, while suffering bomb hits and near misses, retained speed sufficient to attempt a night approach to San Bernardino. Kurita temporarily turned away under heavy pressure, then later reoriented toward the strait, balancing the need to preserve combat power with the operational requirement to reach Leyte's approaches in concert with wider Shogo movements. For U.S. carriers, the day's results were significant but not cost-free. Aircraft losses occurred to AA fire and operational causes. Deck crews cycled ordnance rapidly, managing inventories of torpedoes and AP/G P-bombs across multiple launches. Fuel states for returning aircraft required precise recovery windows as operations stretched into late daylight. Communications kept 7th Fleet apprised that at least one Japanese battleship was sinking or already lost. A cruiser was retiring damaged, and others had sustained hits that would shape their night speed and readiness. Civilian and logistical dimensions intersected indirectly. Merchant and inter-island traffic remained halted along the Sibuyan approaches. Shore communities reported distant detonations and contrails without direct bombardment. Japanese service forces faced the longer-term problem of replacing AA ammunition and managing fuel for damaged escorts now tasked with shepherding crippled ships away from the main body. American logistics measured torpedo and bomb expenditure against expected follow-on operations around Leyte, forecasting resupply from fleet oilers and ammunition ships positioned eastward. By evening, the campaign's peak day had altered comparative strength. The center force continued with 5 operational battleships and a diminished cruiser-destroyer screen. 1 battleship had sunk, 1 heavy cruiser had withdrawn. Others carried varying degrees of damage. U.S. carrier groups remained intact, having imposed losses that reduced Japanese staying power and disrupted timing. The linkage to Palawan Passage was direct. Early submarine strikes had removed key cruisers and forced escort reallocations, amplifying the effects of air attack in the open water that followed. The surviving Japanese units still aimed for San Bernardino under darkness, accepting that the next decisions would be made with fewer ships, tighter fuel margins, and crews fatigued by a full day of air-sea combat. Nightfall on October 24th forced both sides to adapt methods and risk calculations. Kurita's remaining heavy force, 4 battleships, multiple heavy cruisers including Tone-class ships, the light cruiser flagship and destroyers, reordered into night transit columns aimed at San Bernardino Strait. Losses and rescue duties had thinned the screen. Stations were reassigned to preserve anti-submarine and anti-torpedo sectors closest to the capital ships. Radar was used selectively to limit electromagnetic signature. Lookouts and sound gear were emphasized in the shoal-prone approach to the strait. Damage control teams on ships that had taken near misses remained at readiness, with counter-flooding plans pre-written for rapid execution if additional hits occurred. American forces adjusted to the operational picture developed since Palawan. With Darter aground and scuttled, Dace continued shadowing to the extent depth and navigation allowed, reporting headings that suggested Kurita had resumed the advance after maneuvering in the Sibuyan Sea. 7th Fleet concentrated on protecting the Leyte anchorage. Escort carrier task units, taffy groups, cycled night patrols, and readied dawn strike packages. Torpedo inventories on carrier-based TBMS were managed carefully after the day's expenditure. Many aircraft were spotted for launches with general-purpose bombs or depth charges, with plans to rearm once visual contact clarified targets. Communications and intelligence practices shifted under pressure. Japanese staff reduced transmissions to short, encoded signals while using prearranged light and flag procedures within the column. A small number of reconnaissance float planes were prepared for pre-dawn scouting to re-establish situational awareness east of the strait. American commanders, influenced by running reports that Kurita had turned away under air attack, weighed the probability that center force would not attempt San Bernardino. 3rd Fleet's fast carrier groups moved north toward Ozawa's decoy carriers. Surface elements nominally organized as Task Force 34 were not established to block the strait during the night. 7th Fleet's PT boats and pickets covered southern approaches, while the San Bernardino Passage itself lacked a heavy night barrier. Resource management shaped choices. Japanese destroyers tracked remaining depth charges and fuel after rescue and prosecution efforts since Palawan, adopting lower-speed screen patterns to conserve reserves until contact with enemy air or surface units resumed. Battleships maintained engineering status to permit rapid accelerations, but cumulative strain limited prolonged flank speed options. On the American side, escort carriers evaluated remaining aviation gasoline, torpedoes, and bomb stocks against expected dawn operations. Destroyers and destroyer escorts checked Hedgehog and depth charge loads while planning for smoke and gunfire. Support should surface contact occur unexpectedly. The psychological dimension was evident. Japanese crews, having experienced torpedo losses and a day of air attack, drilled for night collision and fire hazards in a narrow strait with strong tidal sets. Officers re-emphasized steering orders and station keeping under blackout, aware that minor errors could cascade in column. American air crews prepared for first light launches against targets whose exact composition and location were not fully confirmed, reviewing attack profiles suitable for large surface ships, but accepting that some TBMS might carry suboptimal ordnance if rearming cycles lagged behind emerging contact reports. Innovation and improvisation appeared at small scales. Japanese navigation teams blended radar ranges with visual fixes on headlands to cross-check tidal drift, using pre-computed tables for the San Bernardino current. Destroyers rotated sonar watches to mitigate fatigue and reduce false contacts in shallow, noisy water. On escort carriers, ordnance crews pre-staged mixed loads and employed rapid fusing checks to minimize deck time between recoveries and relaunches. Radio intelligence operators on American ships flagged any renewed enemy signaling as a trigger for immediate updates to air search plans at dawn. Civilian movement remained suppressed along both coasts of the strait. Fishing and inter-island traffic stayed in harbor under curfews. Shore observers reported engine noise and occasional silhouettes, but no direct bombardment during the night. On Leyte, construction continued on airstrips under blackout, with engineers prioritizing runway repairs and dispersal revetments to sustain the ground campaign irrespective of the offshore naval outcome. By the pre-dawn hours of 25th October, the adaptations had set a new tactical geometry. The center force, reduced but cohesive, aimed to emerge from San Bernardino into the Philippine Sea with sufficient daylight to reach the waters east of Samar. American escort carrier groups stood in support of the landing areas with aircraft and screens ready, but without certainty that a heavy surface force was inbound. Comparative states reflected the preceding days. Japan with fewer cruisers and one battleship lost. Fuel and AA ammunition drawn down. The United States with intact amphibious lodgements, strong carrier aviation to the north, and local escort carriers prepared to improvise against surface contact if required. The night's restraint on both sides would give way to rapid decisions once sunrise revealed actual positions and compositions. Dawn on 25th October 1944 revealed Corrida's center force east of San Bernardino, closing from the northwest on U.S. escort carrier units supporting the Leyte landings. The nearest was Taffy 3 with 6 CVES, 3 destroyers, and destroyer escort screening, at approximately 6:45 to 0650 lookouts on the carrier's reported battleship and heavy cruiser silhouettes. Taffy 3 launched aircraft with whatever ordnance was ready. Depth charges, general-purpose bombs, and limited torpedoes, while the screen laid smoke and the carriers turned east to open range. Corrida organized into pursuit with battleships and heavy cruisers pressing to gun range. Japanese main batteries fired at distances beyond 20,000 yards, adjusting salvos through rain squalls and smoke. U.S. escort carriers maneuvered continuously, generating wind for launches while masking with weather. Destroyers Johnston, Hole, and Heermann, followed by destroyer escorts led by Samuel B. Roberts, executed independent torpedo attacks to disrupt the Japanese line. The tactics aimed to force evasive turns that reduced effective fire control and bought minutes for launching additional strike waves. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and, as the fight developed, from nearby Taffy 2 and Taffy 1, attacked repeatedly. Pilots coordinated harassment with smoke and cloud cover, reporting hits and near misses on cruisers at the head of the Japanese column. Many sorties carried mixed or suboptimal loads due to the speed of the launch cycle, yet attacks compelled defensive maneuvers and drew destroyers out of formation for rescue and screening. Communications from the carriers tracked ammunition states and signaled deck cycles as successive composite squadrons returned, refueled, and rearmed for repeated runs. The surface exchanges produced rapid losses on both sides. Around 8:30 to 9 o'clock, Gambier Bay, under sustained cruiser fire, as range briefly closed, lost speed and sank. Casualties numbered over 120, with the majority of the crew rescued later by escorts and aircraft-directed vessels. U.S. destroyers Hole and Johnston, damaged by gunfire while launching torpedoes, were lost in the mid-morning. Samuel B. Roberts, engaging at close range with 5-inch fire, was sunk after fighting to protect the carriers. Heermann, heavily engaged and damaged, remained afloat and continued screening. The remaining carriers, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Katun Bay, and St. Lo, maintained flight operations while evading. Japanese heavy cruisers at the van absorbed concentrated air and torpedo attention. Chokai was disabled by bomb damage and secondary explosions and was later scuttled by destroyers after crew evacuation. Chikuma, struck by air torpedoes and gunfire during withdrawal, sank after crews abandoned ship and destroyers recovered survivors. Suzuya, initially avoiding direct hits, suffered catastrophic damage after near misses and fire in torpedo mounts. She was abandoned and sank. Additional cruisers, including Kumano, sustained bow and machinery damage. Tone was hit but remained operational. Battleships Yamato, Kongo, Haruna, and Nagato fired intermittently under smoke and weather, reporting limited confirmed hits as formation cohesion degraded. The cumulative effect of torpedo runs, persistent air attacks, and smoke-induced range errors altered momentum. By late morning, Kurita faced reduced cruiser numbers, dispersed escorts, and uncertainties about the location of stronger U.S. forces. Reports of new airstrikes inbound from multiple bearings suggested that carrier groups beyond the escort carriers were within range. Fuel and ammunition tracking indicated that prolonged high-speed pursuit would complicate later retirement through the straits. Shortly before midday, Kurita ordered a turnaway to regroup, then initiated withdrawal to the north and west, breaking contact with the escort carriers that had been his immediate objective. For U.S. forces, the tactical outcome mixed severe losses with a preserved lodgment. Taffy 3 lost 1 escort carrier, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort in the surface action. Several surviving carriers and escorts sustained shell hits and structural damage, but continued flight operations. Aircraft losses included dozens to AA fire and operational causes across the morning. Japanese losses in the Samar engagement included 3 heavy cruisers sunk, at least 1 heavy cruiser severely damaged and withdrawn, and multiple ships with bomb and shell damage that reduced speed or combat effectiveness. Comparative figures reflected asymmetry. Japanese surface units retained battleship strength, but with degraded cruiser screen. The U.S. escort groups maintained carrier decks launching recurrent strikes, despite lighter armor and armament. Civilians on Samar and Leyte recorded distant gunfire, smoke columns, and aircraft movements. No deliberate bombardment of shore targets occurred in the engagement zone. Naval search and rescue expanded into the afternoon, as both sides' destroyers collected survivors from sinking cruisers and damaged escorts, constrained by ongoing air activity and the need to clear the area before additional strikes. The decision to withdraw constituted the turning point in the Palawan Passage thread of the larger campaign. The route chosen through the choke point had enabled early submarine attack and reduced cruiser availability. The subsequent air-sea battle off Samar consumed time, fuel, and ships needed to reach the Leyte anchorage. With center force retiring, the immediate threat to the transport area diminished, even as other actions on October 25th continued elsewhere in the theater. The operational balance after midday favored the U.S. lodgment, while Japanese command preserved surviving capital ships for retirement rather than risk further losses in confused conditions east of Samar. Kurita's order to disengage on October 25th set parallel withdrawals in motion. The remaining battleships, Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, turned north and west to re-enter San Bernardino Strait. Surviving cruisers and destroyers regrouped by signals and visual bearings through rain squalls, smoke, and scattered oil slicks. Damage control teams secured fires and shored bulkheads. Medical parties triaged shrapnel, and burn injuries accumulated since the Sibuyan Sea. Fuel calculations were revised to ensure enough margin for night steaming against currents at the strait. Escorts detailed to rescue duties brought aboard hundreds of survivors from Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, while others recovered personnel from destroyers that had risked close screening during the chase. American units executed a different form of consolidation. Taffy 3's remaining carriers continued flight operations while turning east and south to safer water, recovering aircraft low on fuel and rearming for follow-up strikes against retiring ships. Destroyers and destroyer escorts not engaged in screening shifted to search and rescue, guided by airborne observers who marked rafts and swimmers with dye and smoke. Communications linked Taffy groups to 7th Fleet to coordinate picket lines and medical evacuation. Damage surveys began on Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, and Kitkun Bay, each with shell hits of varying severity but air-capable decks intact. Comparative losses from the Palawan-Sibuyan Samar sequence crystallized as reports stabilized. On the Japanese side, 1 battleship sunk, Musashi, 5 heavy cruisers lost, Atago, Maya, Chokai, Chikuma, Suzuya, and several cruisers heavily damaged, Takao, Miyoko, Kumano, with varying propulsion and structural impairments. Destroyer losses and damage reflected both air attack and scuttling actions during rescue. On the U.S. side, 2 escort carriers lost, Gambier Bay to surface gunfire, St. Lo later to a suicide aircraft. 2 destroyers, Howell, Johnston, 1 destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts, and 1 submarine, Darter, grounded and abandoned. Dace remained operational. Aircraft losses across the day's actions reached into the dozens, divided between combat and operational causes. These figures did not include the separate southern and northern actions under Shogo, which unfolded concurrently. Rescue and withdrawal created additional risks. Japanese destroyers carrying hundreds of survivors became targets as air search resumed. Small-caliber AA ammunition was rationed after high expenditure at Samar. In one case, evacuees from a disabled heavy cruiser transferred to an escort that was later intercepted and sunk during the broader retirement, compounding human losses and complicating post-war accounting. American search and rescue faced fuel and daylight limits. Aircraft vectored ships toward rafts while balancing the chance of renewed surface contact. Survivors from Gambier Bay, Howell, Johnston, and Samuel B. Roberts were recovered over hours and, in some cases, days, with exposure and dehydration increasing fatalities after initial sinkings. Operationally, the immediate consequence of the withdrawal was the failure to reach the Lady Transport area. 7th Fleet's anchorage remained functional. Army logistics ships continued unloading vehicles, ammunition, and fuel that sustained the ground battle. Japanese command, having preserved 4 battleships and a number of cruisers and destroyers, regained sea room, but at the cost of the cruiser screen intended to coordinate scouting and anti-aircraft sectors for any renewed thrust. Ammunition states, particularly heavy AA, were low aboard multiple ships, and damage to directors and rangefinders reduced effective gunnery for the near term. Navigation back through San Bernardino Strait under blackout and current required disciplined station keeping. The formations avoided the shallow margins where turn radii shrank. Spacing increased to prevent collisions, and radar use remained limited to essential ranges. Engineering logs recorded reduced maximum speeds on ships that had shipped water or suffered shaft, or bearing issues during evasive maneuvers. Fuel transfers between destroyers and larger units were postponed until safer waters, tightening margins for escorts assigned to rear guards and rescue. Onshore, the aftermath appeared in 2 registers. In the central Philippines, civilians reported debris fields and oil sheens drifting toward coastlines, with isolated landfalls of rafts and wreckage. Military authorities restricted shoreline access and directed local craft to assist recovery under supervision. In Japan, wartime announcements framed the actions as a counterblow that had inflicted losses on U.S. carriers while acknowledging heavy fighting. Detailed ship names and statuses were not immediately released. In the United States, communiques highlighted the defense of the Leyte Lodgment and credited escort carriers, destroyers, and aircraft with disrupting a superior surface force. Names and loss lists were issued as notifications proceeded. Finance and supply lines absorbed new tasks. Japanese service forces evaluated routes for damaged cruisers toward repair anchorages in the South China Sea and Singapore, where dock capacity and material shortages constrained timelines. U.S. fleet logistics adjusted ordnance and fuel deliveries to escort carriers and surface screens, replacing torpedoes and bombs used since October 24th, while planning for continued air support of the land campaign. Salvage decisions were made on stranded or irrecoverable hulls, including measures to deny materiel to the enemy, where scuttling had not fully destroyed equipment. By the evening of the 25th of October, the Palawan Passage thread had reached its operational end state. The Japanese center force, reduced and fatigued, was outward bound with capital ships intact, but their cruiser arm depleted. The U.S. escort carrier groups remained in being, with one group heavily battered, yet still launching aircraft. The Lady Transport area continued operations, while search and rescue persisted into the night. The sequence that began with a deliberate transit of a choke point ended with parallel retreats shaped by fuel, damage, and daylight. conditions that would inform assessments, allocations, and narratives in the days that followed. In historical assessments, the Palawan Passage sequence is treated as the opening mechanism of a linked operation that ran from 23rd to 25th October 1944. The submarine ambush removed 2 heavy cruisers and disabled a third before the center force entered the Sibuyan Sea. Air attacks on 24th October sank 1 battleship, Musashi, and damaged cruisers including Myoko and Kumano. On 25th October, the surface action east of Samar cost the center force 3 more heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, Suzuya, while U.S. forces lost 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay to surface fire, St. Lo to a suicide aircraft, 2 destroyers, Howell, Johnston, and 1 destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts. USS Darter was lost to grounding. USS Dace remained operational. Comparative tallies for Kurita's formation over the 3 days were 1 battleship sunk, 5 heavy cruisers sunk, at least 3 heavy cruisers disabled and withdrawn, with battleships Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna surviving the engagement. Operational outcomes intersected with logistics and fuel. The failure to reach the Leyte transport area on October 25th left 7th Fleet's unloading schedule largely intact, sustaining U.S. ground operations on Leyte. Japanese destroyers and cruisers expended significant anti-aircraft ammunition and fuel in rescue and high-speed maneuvering, reducing options for renewed thrusts. Subsequent retirements reflected these constraints. Takao and Myoko moved toward repair facilities in Singapore with limited combat utility. Kumano, damaged at Samar, was sunk by carrier aircraft on November 25th near Dassel Bay. Kongo was sunk by USS Celeon on November 21st in the Taiwan Strait. Haruna was sunk at Kure on the 28th of July, 1945. Yamato was sunk during Operation Tengo on the 7th of April, 1945. Nagato was used in tests at Bikini Atoll in 1946. The attrition of heavy cruisers reduced scouting reach and anti-aircraft arcs for the remaining battleships through the final months of the war. Strategically, the sequence reinforced several patterns already visible in 1944. Choke point transit under opposing submarines and carriers produced disproportionate effects when escort density and radar-directed coordination were limited. U.S. doctrine that combined submarine patrol lines with rapid carrier concentration exploited predictable routing through confined waters. Japanese doctrine, shaped by the need to conserve fuel and the requirement to maintain column order in reef-bound lanes, accepted risks that became critical when surprise was lost. The decision cycle was compressed by geography. Early losses at the passage altered screen composition, which increased the cost of withstanding carrier strikes in the Sibuyan Sea, which in turn reduced staying power at Samar. Intelligence and command arrangements figure prominently in later analyses. The loss of the flagship Atago on the 23rd of October imposed a staff transfer at the start of the run. U.S. contact reports from Darter and Dace provided composition and timing that helped direct carrier strikes a day later. To the north, the decoy carrier force under Ozawa succeeded in drawing 3rd Fleet's fast carriers, shaping the distribution of U.S. strength on October 25th, while 7th Fleet's escort carriers and destroyers carried the local burden east of Samar. Assessments differ on how these choices affected outcomes, but the record shows that the Palawan contacts fixed the center force's route and schedule in a way that made subsequent engagements more likely. Civilian and regional effects were indirect in this phase. The choke point action occurred offshore. Coastal communities in Palawan and Samar reported debris, oil, and survivors' landfalls in limited numbers, without the destruction associated with shore bombardment. The larger consequence for the Philippines was continuity of U.S. supply into Leyte, which influenced the ground campaign through late 1944 and enabled subsequent operations in Luzon in early 1945. Commemoration and wreck documentation frame the legacy. Memorials and ship histories in the United States mark the actions of taffy groups and the lost escorts. Japanese sources record ship and crew losses from the cruisers and Musashi and the retirements of surviving capital ships. Wreck searches in the 21st century have located several of the ships lost in the Sibuyan Sea and off Samar, providing material confirmation of damage patterns recorded in action reports and logs. Historiographically, the Palawan Passage is cited as a case study in how geography, fuel economy, and multi-domain pressure combine to shape naval campaigns. The comparative data emphasize asymmetry in outcomes. On one side, maintenance of an amphibious lodgment, with losses concentrated in lighter carriers and escorts. On the other, preservation of battleships at the cost of the cruiser screen and the operational objective. The sequence supports conclusions that control of transit corridors and the timing leverage derived from them can impose strategic results before the main body reaches its intended target.